Hello and welcome. My name is Sanjay Soni. Here is a microlearning readiness video on ingesting data using Polybase in Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Now, let's get started. Hi, Matt. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Sanjay.
So, what do you do at Microsoft?
I'm a principal program manager in the Azure SQL Data Warehouse team.
So let's talk about data loading and preparation. I know that Azure SQL Data Warehouse provides a lot of choices in this space. Could you please take us through the common patterns for loading data into this platform?
Sure, Sanjay. There's a couple of patterns that we typically see, and these follow kind of the technology that's enabled within Azure SQL Data Warehouse. The first is kind of batch-based loads or parallel loads into the warehouse. And the second is a gated load or kind of a single-threaded load. There's really kind of two scenarios for those. The parallel loads are really for kind of loading large data volumes in parallel. We use a technology called Polybase, which allows multiple nodes to be able to execute the data import in parallel. Very fast, very efficient. It's commonly used by hosting data in Azure Data Lake, Azure Data Blob Store, and Azure HD Insight that may host that original data, and we're going to ingest it into SQL DW. The second pattern is through the BCP, or the bulk copy methodology in Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And this is really used for kind of singleton patterns, kind of very trickle streamed in of small sets of data. So you can imagine copying data out of, say, SQL Server, and then just simply loading in 1,000 rows or something like that for a dimension table.
Is that a batch-oriented process mostly, or?
The bulk copy it's a single-threaded, and it really is focused on the way that the data goes into the system. So as we move to kind of slide 2 here, really what we're talking about is kind of this single-gated approach of how the data moves in. In the BCP model, really what happens is the data goes through what we call our control node. That data is then dispersed into the individual compute nodes, which store the data. And so we really have this kind of pattern of going through the control node to push data into the system. Now, this works really well for something small like a dimension table. Maybe you're going to upload 50,000 rows or something like that every so often. So it's really efficient at doing that. But it doesn't really serve when you want to do larger dynamic loads, or you have a very large amount of data that you want to load. So say maybe you're doing a daily load of your ordering data. You want to be able to ingest that very quickly. In that model, we use what's called Polybase. And so what Polybase allows you to do is it follows the same pattern, but it instructs the system to go out and use those individual nodes to ingest the data in parallel. And really how this happens is we define what we call an external table. And an external table is a representation of the data that is sourced outside of the engine itself. So in this case, it could be data sitting in blob storage, for example. And the compute nodes are smart enough to know to go out and read that file in parallel and process the chunks that they can so that the data ingestion is done in parallel. So from a format like a text file, for example, even a very large one, each one of the nodes can read a portion of the text file, be able to pull that data in, ingest or manipulate it and ingest it very rapidly as the other nodes are doing the same with their parts. So you can imagine the simple analogy of drinking a glass of water. Yeah. In one fashion, in the BCP path, you're drinking through a single straw. And so you can drink water fairly fast. Yes. In this example, you're drinking through multiple straws, so all at the same time. So you're able to drink, you're able to drink a lot more water that way. Yes.
Great. So this Polybase option sounds very interesting. So Matt, can you please show us a demo of loading data with Polybase?
Sure. So I'm going to load some zip code data. We're going to look over at the actual CSV file, so just a common separated value file that I got from the US Postal Service. And you can see that it just has a bunch of columns. So state identifier, the actual state abbreviation, and a zip code, and a bunch of other kind of columns here. So I've uploaded this to Azure Blob Storage, and I'm now going to connect to it. I'm going to go over to my Azure SQL Data Warehouse. I'm connected via the SQL Server Management Studio, Microsoft SQL Management Studio. I'm going to run through a set of scripts. The first thing I will do is I'll create a master key. I've already done this in this data warehouse, but what a master key does is it gives you the ability to encrypt the credentials being stored later. The next thing I'm going to do is create a data source. And so I'm creating a data source that points to the location of where my file is sitting in blob storage. This is the blob container itself. And it just tells the SQL Data Warehouse where to go find the file.
So this is the external file you were talking about?
Yeah. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to define a type of the file. So in this case, I'm going to say, this is a skip header CSV. Now, if we go back to my Excel, you'll see that my first row has a column title. Well, I don't need that as my data set, so I'm going to skip that. And I'm simply doing that by telling it to start on row number 2. It's pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward setup. Now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the creation of an external table. Now this is where SQL Data Warehouse and the Polybase capabilities are pretty interesting. What SQL Data Warehouse can do is it can take the generation of a metadata around a table and produce that into the system so that you can interact with it just like you would any other table within the system. But the data itself doesn't actually reside in the data warehouse. It's sitting outside, in this case, in a CSV file on blob storage. So you can see I've mapped all of the columns, and I left them all in here so you can see that you can create quite a few columns. And again, these match what I was given by the Postal Service. And then there's some key kind of identifier information. So in this case, you can see the location. I'm telling it in my blob container, I'm looking for that particular CSV file. I've pointed to where it is in my data source and what format I want to expect that file to be in. Now I'm going to go ahead and execute this. I'm going to see it takes just a second for us to actually create the table. Now if I scroll down and I go look at the table, the first thing I want to do is I'm actually going to just select some data out. Now what SQL Data Warehouse is doing at this point is it's gone out and it's executed a query across all of the nodes, it's reading the file, and it's pulling all of the data back in, and then it's going to manipulate the data once it has it. In this case, it's streaming it all because it's a CSV file and there's no remote execution. In this case, you can see it's now returned the 2 columns that I asked for, and it's type formatted them. As you can see, I've just pulled those back. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take that data and I'm going to create another table out of it. Now this is an operation we call a CTAS, or a create table as select. So I'm going to create a table from this one. And since this is a zip code file, I'm going to create a zip codes table. And it's really a dimension table in a data warehouse. So I'm going to create it as a replicated, which means it'll exist on all of the nodes for faster execution. I can simply highlight this, and by executing my query, SQL Data Warehouse will go create a new table, and it will take all of the data from that external file and pull it into the data warehouse. As you can see, it was about 30,000 rows. Did it fairly quickly. And then finally, I can start to go execute queries against that. So again, I executed a query against the external table, and now I'm going to execute one locally. In this case, I was looking for the zip code here in Redmond, Washington. And you can see now very quickly I'm able to take a CSV file, just using simple T-SQL constructs, being able to pull that data into the data warehouse and start to work with it in whatever fashion I need. In this case, zip codes. I could add that to my queries for deeper analytics, or I could add that to some of my reporting, so I could isolate my orders by zip code, for example. And I have all of that detail simply by just running a set of T-SQL scripts.
That's fantastic. So when data is loaded, it's all clean, then we can use tools like Power BI to get insights from the data.
Yeah, and you can use all of those constructs that you're familiar with, manipulating data inside of T-SQL, so your developers don't have to go learn a new tool set. They don't have to learn another language to be able to manipulate data that they get from things like CSV files, for example.
That was great. Thank you so much, Matt, for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching this video. Learn more about this and other topics at azure.com/SQLDW.